Again, hopefully you are reading the chapter on elasticity in the textbook. It will give you some other nice examples. One of them is going to be gun buybacks. So if you think about gun buybacks in many cities, what we have in effect, if you think about the supply, now let's not think about the supply of guns or the demand for guns. Let's think about the supply of old, rusted, not functioning guns, right? So if we think about, in effect, what does that supply schedule look like? Really, people have old, rusty, cruddy guns that they're quite willing to get rid of. And maybe there's some demand for them. And now, if you think about what happens with gun buybacks, when government officials say we will, and this, by the way, we would expect this to be the market clearing price and the market clearing quantity. Government officials jump in and decide to buy some guns, and what happens? Increase in the number of consumers, an increase in demand, and what happens? Not going to be any change in the price. There will, however, be an increase in the quantity of used, broken guns, right? That are taken out, well, that are purchased. However, what's happening to the number of guns in private hands? Nothing. That doesn't change at all. In effect, this actually makes new guns more valuable because in a situation where there's a gun buyback program where government officials will take guns off your hands for a specified price. If you think about, if I buy a new gun, I now know that I can, whatever the condition, sell it back at, might not be that much. It might be $150. It might be $200. But previously, the amount I would get once it was broken down and used up would be zero. And now I actually can expect to get something greater than zero. So it actually, in many ways, right, increases the value of new guns because because we get an increase in the eventual sale price to government. So in effect, there will be no change in the number of sort of guns that are out of circulation that aren't working very well. There very well will be, if we think about an increase in the benefit of new guns, that would be an increase in the expectation. Let's go, right? So if we think about, there would be no change in the number of guns in private hands in this market, or at least in terms of the people who are using them. Let's think about now, let's go back to our normal supply and our normal demand schedule. As a result of government promising to buy these guns back, what's going to happen? We're going to have an increase in expectations and information about the benefit, thus increasing the number of guns in circulation. Now, again, in this state, I think generally speaking, people aren't particularly opposed to guns in circulation. I see them all over the place. But if you buy the public policy argument that we would want to reduce the number of guns in circulation, gun buybacks almost certainly do the direct opposite. They almost certainly end up with more guns in circulation. Again, is this even dependent on elasticity? No. Okay. There's other examples, right? Should we burn ivory or buy ivory? Let's take a look at slavery. So, despite slavery being ended in the United States, slavery, and in many other countries, slavery does still exist in parts of the world. And so we have a question about what our policy response should be. There's also a discussion people have about should the federal government in the 1860s, instead of engaging in the Civil War, just purchased all of the slaves and set them free? And there's questions about whether we would have had the money to do that, whether the government had the ability to do that, etc. But let's just think about it from the practical point of view. Let's bring it into the modern context and basically say, should we as private individuals, if we care about slavery around the world, should we go to those areas where there is slavery still, and should we buy those slaves and set them free? It's an interesting question, right? People say, oh, I understand markets. I understand that I could express my preferences through markets. And so let's take a look at two different options, and I'll try and draw these somewhat carefully. So here would be, if we, again, were in class, we could have a reasoned discussion about whether the supply of slaves is relatively elastic or inelastic, and whether the demand for slaves is relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. But let's take a look at two situations. One where we have a very elastic demand, right? Compared to this. Very elastic, very inelastic, right? Very small, very large response, very small response. And again, we could put these on the same graph. Hopefully this makes sense to you. Now let's take a look. We have a very, it's not perfectly inelastic supply schedule. It is upward sloping a little bit versus a very elastic supply schedule. So let's see what's going to happen. Well, let's think about this. What will us going to these areas and buying slaves do in either of these markets? Go down our list of determinants and maybe commit yourself to something. What will change? Supply, demand, neither or both, and why? I'll wait while you write that down. Or you can pause the video, but I'm guessing you probably won't. So hopefully you've jotted something down. Will supply, demand, neither, or both change? Well, when we go and buy slaves there, I think you hopefully are understanding that that's going to change demand. I hope that's what you're saying. Increase in the number of consumers, right? Previously, we were not consumers. Now we are consumers. So I'm just going to increase, let's see if this works. I'm going to increase demand at all points by, I'll try and do it by, if I increase this by that much, maybe I'll actually, let's see, is that better? Yeah, that's probably better. So that would be our new demand schedule there. And here, we're going to have some problems because I think we're going to be off the board. Maybe not quite. Okay. So over here in this market, what's the response? Well, we have an increase in the price. And over here, we're going to have an increase in the price. Over here, we're going to have an increase in the quantity. And over here, we're going to have an increase in the quantity. So should we buy slaves and free them? Well, it turns out the answer is really going to depend on elasticity. In both situations, we have seen an increase in the price of slaves and an increase in the quantity of slaves. However, there's a big difference between, so if we think about this, this still is the demand for slaves in slavery. I'm just going to put that as the private demand. So this is the demand schedule for people who want to continue to use slaves as slaves. This is the aggregate demand when we add up people who want to free the slaves and people who want to use them as slaves. Over here, this is the demand for people who want to use slaves as slaves, and this is our aggregate demand. So it turns out here's another neat thing with supply and demand. We can now actually disaggregate these and start talking about what happens. So I'm over here, so let's look over here. And I have to draw this probably a little more carefully. We've seen an increase in the number of slaves. And the result is going to be a decrease in the number of slaves that are still in private hands. That increase in the price is going to cause some people who previously wanted slaves to go ahead and go find substitutes, right? Cool. So we've seen by doing this, we've seen a decrease in the number of slaves who are still in slavery. Of course, we've also seen this big increase here. And that increase represents what? That increase, this number here, we have gone from this number of people who were taken from their homes by force and sold into slavery. And now we have this many people who were taken by force and sold into slavery. So we have achieved a reduction in the number of people who live in slavery, but at the cost of having a larger number of people taken by force and sold into slavery. might still be a reasonable trade-off. So something we could ask. We could figure out we've reduced the number of people who are stuck in slavery by increasing the number of people who are sold into slavery. How about over here? Well, if we think about what's happened, we've seen an increase in the number of people who are sold into slavery. However, we've seen a large decrease in the number of people who are living in slavery. So again, as a result of this increase in price, people have gone and found substitutes, and the result has been a large decrease in the number of people who are living in slavery. Which one of these is preferable? I hope you're pointing to this, right? We've seen a large decrease in people living in slavery and a small increase compared to that over there in the number of people who are sold into slavery, who are taken by force. Over here, on the other hand, we've seen a small decrease in the number of slaves, people who are living in slavery, and a large increase in the number of people who were sold into slavery. Incidentally, you might be saying, aren't there two other situations where we have highly inelastic demand and supply schedules, and another one where we have highly elastic supply and demand schedules? Yes, there is another option. Those are two other options. All right. So now the question, but let's go with this for the time being, because the other two are indeterminate. We're not actually sure what happens. So now the question would be, which one of these situations do you think we're in? In this situation, it probably makes sense to go buy those slaves. In this situation, I would argue we should be a lot more cautious and probably should not. Turns out getting taken from your home by force and shipped around the world is really traumatic. Even if you end up getting out of it, that's definitely something that we would like to avoid. So which one of these things do you think we're at? In poor countries with bad infrastructure, without a lot of electricity, etc., do you think that there are lots of close substitutes for human labor? I would argue probably not. It's probably hard to find a substitute. So my experience in Togo was, if you're going to wash clothes, you're going to wash them by hand, and it's a lot of work. And so you're either going to have to maybe pay somebody in the labor market, or maybe you could buy them against their will, but there's not a lot of good substitutes for human labor, which would point to which? Inelastic demand or elastic demand? Take a look at your notes. Hopefully you're going to point to relatively inelastic demand. So we're definitely over here in terms of inelastic demand versus elastic demand. Now in the United States, I suspect in this day and age, we're over here. There's lots of good substitutes. It's easy to find substitutes. But in much of the world where slavery still persists, we're over here. So now the question becomes, do we have an elastic or an inelastic supply? How easy is it to increase the production of slaves in cases where the price increases? And the answer is pretty easy. Basically, the production function for slavers, is largely a Toyota pickup truck and a bunch of guys in the back with AK-47s. Doesn't cost a lot. The opportunity costs for those people in the back of the pickup are relatively low. They don't have a lot else they can do. And so we're not over here for supply. We're almost certainly over here with supply and demand. So what that tells us is we should probably be really careful. We should probably be really reluctant to go buy slaves around the world. Now, if you go back to the 1860s in the United States, we're also probably right here, right? Had we tried to purchase slaves, it was relatively easy. Now, again, in that instance, the main production function for slaves was at that point that we had banned the importation of slaves. However, so the production function was largely breeding programs. So there would have been a lag of 9 months, a little bit longer before people were productive, right? As slaves, before they had grown up enough to contribute to the production function. But again, we probably were still over here. Not a lot of great substitutes. And so we almost certainly would have ended up with more people living in slavery. A small change in the number of people living in slavery, but a large increase in the number of people who were slaves.